Cecilia Malmström. I'm a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington. Today, we will talk about globalization, and I have a fabulous panel with me here today. Börje Brende, who is president of the World Economic Forum, just back from Davos, and he was also foreign minister in Norway. We have Arantxa González Laya, who is the dean of Sciences Po in Paris, former Minister of Foreign Affairs in Spain, and also former president of the International Trade Center, ITC. And we have, last but certainly not least, Adam Posen, who is the president of the Peterson Institute. You are all very welcome. Thanks for taking time.
Thank you.
So, globalization, deglobalization, friendshoring, reshoring, homeshoring, Buy America, Buy European, fragmentation. The trade dictionary has certainly expanded with new expressions this year. And they all apply that globalization is dead, or at least almost dead, that global trade has peaked, and that we better focus on ourselves and, in the best of cases, our neighbors. Russia's terrible aggression war on Ukraine, high energy prices, inflation, certainly contributes to this gloomy mood. On the one hand, trade has peaked. The Russian aggression has made Europe realize how dangerous it is to be too dependent on one country on energy, and also on another country on rare earth metals, China. There are severe trade tensions between the US and China. We have a WTO that is weak, and that nobody really seems to have the political clout to reform. There is a geopolitization of trade, and business need to take security considerations. On the other hand, trade has done rather well during the pandemic. Global value chains have proven to be quite efficient. Business have become more diverse, more resilient, and we have seen a unique global cooperation around vaccines in record time, saving millions of lives. We also have a strong alliance against Russia to support Ukraine, sanction Russia, and that is, of course, something that will need to continue for quite some time, unfortunately. But we also see the resurrection or the coming back of industrial policy, stronger than we have seen for a very long time, both in the EU and the US investing heavily in semiconductors and batteries. We have seen the IRA, the most well-known acronym in Davos, Inflation Reduction Act, not to be confused with the Irish Republican Army. That is a very ambitious program to invest in green technology and energy. It should be welcomed in many ways, but it causes concerns in Europe and elsewhere because there are some discriminatory elements. So we will try to dig a bit deeper into this discussion and try to understand what is actually happening and how can we interpret that, where are we heading? So Arantxa, from a European perspective, help us understand, is globalization dead?
Thank you very much, Cecilia, first of all, for putting this panel together and for choosing this topic, which is extremely important, at least where I'm sitting in Brussels, in Europe, a continent that is very dependent on international trade and whose markets, when open, are also a big engine for other countries to thrive. I mean, when you ask me this question, I think of Mark Twain, you know, when he said, you know, news of my death have been greatly exaggerated. And I feel a bit the same. You know, news of the death of globalization have been greatly exaggerated. Globalization is not dead, but it is today being pushed by four forces that we need to understand, and whose good management will give us a future or another one. So a future of international cooperation or a future of fragmentation with the impact that would have, especially inflation. And we know how damaging inflation is to the global economy. These four forces, very briefly, I like to use the S word to talk about them. First, international trade is more and more about services, and in particular, digitally powered services. The services are growing massively. They are not on the decline, they are on the ascent. The second S, sustainability. There is no way we can link today international trade from the fight against climate change, protection of biodiversity, and sustainability more broadly, including that of oceans, as we know from the recent WTO deal on fish subsidies. So sustainability has to be at the heart of this new globalization. The third S, and it's you've alluded to it, is states. States are back. State aids are back in full swing, with full force. Some of them are, allowed, permitted by international rules. Many of them are not. They are unleveling the playing field, and they will be damaging for not only for countries that don't have deep pockets to spend, but they will also be damaging for the countries that have deep pockets and probably end up misusing this financing, understanding that in any event, we will need states to drive the two big transformations, technological and ecological. The fourth S, the trickiest of all, is security. In that we cannot today divorce trade from the risk of weaponizing international trade, from conflict that is back here in Europe, in our continent, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the question again is, how do we deal with these security concerns? Do we turn inwards? Do we hide behind our walls, or do we find a different way, which is probably managing better the risks that security poses? So in a nutshell, Cecilia, globalization is here. Globalization is changing. Globalization is today being powered by different ingredients. And the key to all of us will be, how do we manage this new phase of globalization in a way it's in our hands?
Thank you very much for that. And you picked up on a very important trends that we will certainly come back to all of them. But turning to Adam, the United States used to be the world's biggest advocate for open trade and economies. And now we see a skepticism towards trade, towards globalization, a focus on Buy America, on friendshoring, on export controls, etc. How should we interpret this change that has come not only now, but the recent years in the US?
Thank you, Cecilia, and thank you for being such a voice for evidence-based liberalism in the best sense, and globalism on behalf of Peterson and just those values. I'll pick up in a slightly different direction than Arantxa. I think the US has fundamentally changed or reverted back to an old way. Clearly, in the international economic sphere, there's a huge amount of continuity between Biden and Trump, unfortunately. And the USTR, and used to be your counterparts, Lighthizer and Tai, are very, very similar and have very openly said they have very similar goals. And all these are wrong. Let's be very clear, these are wrong. But they're quite popular in the Congress. They're less popular in the broader public than people seem to assume. So it's really a cynical gamble about certain electoral districts and the perception that certain electoral districts in states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and West Virginia, where you have a combination of white males who are swing voters, they think, who are in deindustrializing regions or deindustrialized regions, and in states where the vote is up for grabs. And very cynically, this happens. As I argued earlier, about a year ago, obviously the Russian invasion or barbaric invasion of Ukraine and the ongoing tensions with China, to me, catalyzed this process, meaning they don't start it, but they reinforce it and accelerate it. But as you and I started talking about, 6-7 years ago when Trump was elected, the US, we are moving to what I've called a post-American global economy. And it's not that the US wasn't enormously hypocritical and self-dealing in successive governments in international affairs and foreign policy, and the two former foreign ministers are well aware of this, but that it was kept within bounds and that it could be shamed into behaving well or even self-censoring into behaving well. I made the analogy, you're the chair of a committee or the chair of a club, you self-deal a little bit, you get certain privileges for being the chair, everybody accepts that, but when you start abusing it, then the club breaks down. And unfortunately, that's where we are. So I would say there are two key themes, just picking up on what you and Arantxa said. Trade is not the only measure. And a lot of other measures, Arantxa rightly focused us on services as well as goods trade, but investment flows, information flows, idea flows, people flows, cultural flows, these are all part of globalization as well. This is why I've spoken in the past about not deglobalization, but a corrosion of globalization. The US withdrawing the way it has and behaving badly erodes the quality of globalization, erodes how even it is, how inclusive it is, how dependable it is. It doesn't take it away. And that leads to the second point, which is the agency of third countries. This comes up very visibly in East Asia in response to US-China conflict, but also in Europe in discussions over Ukraine and Russia and China, that the US, like most things in real life, you can do more harm more easily than you can get people to play along with you or to follow you. And so the fact that the US government, successive US governments, the US Congress is down this isolationist nationalist path in economics, as embodied by the IRA. I don't mean to be so airy-fairy about it. The IRA is a very clear embodiment of it and says, well, we'll subsidize, and if all of you subsidize too, that's fine with us. Of course, directly harms the developing countries and makes all our populations worse off. So it's up to the European Union, to Japan, to Australia, to Canada, but also the developing world to try to stand up. And just as when Cecilia was European Commissioner for Trade and had to deal with the US essentially withdrawing from the WTO dispute settlement, one created a dispute settlement for those who were willing to participate. I think we need to think in terms of those creative solutions. It's not great news for the WTO or for that matter, the IMF. We may have to be plurilateral for a while, but I think the agency of non-US, non-China countries and the non-trade aspects of globalization are the key to moving forward.
Wow, these are lots of tracks that we need to come back to, all of them. But Birger, you just back from Davos, you're sharing the World Economic Forum, and the theme of this year's week was actually fragmentation with a question mark, but all the panels were more or less about different aspects on this, and there were participants from all over the world, actually, even if of course the West is overrepresented because of its location. How do you see this from a global perspective? If you were to sum up a little bit last week in fragmentation, what is the state of the world? Is it fragmented?
It is in a process of fragmentation, and what we tried to underline in Davos at our annual meeting was that the cost of a further economic fragmentation is high. And I think this is probably missing from the public discussion, not on this terrific podcast, but we also try to look at where can we still collaborate in the fragmented world. So if we were to then really leave the thinking of win-win that was the basis of the globalization, I think that would reduce and shave off a lot of growth. We know that during the 3 last decades, we have doubled the global GDP, and trade has been the engine very much behind this growth. That growth led to 1 billion people lifted out of extreme poverty. We have seen a lot of developing countries becoming emerging economies, and emerging economies becoming industrialized economies. That has also this globalization exported deflation. That's why we haven't seen inflation in the last decades. Of course, there has been some inequalities, but that I think is based on lack of use of national tools, where you can also adjust a bit, at least for inequalities, not only a bit, but you can in a major way. Look at the Nordic countries that have had substantial growth, but Gini coefficient inequalities have not necessarily been increasing. I'm very concerned now that we will lose the baby with the bathwater. Of course, we have to re-engineer or re-globalize. We have to adjust, also as Arantxa said, for sustainability, security. My view is that trade has to be, and investment has to be at the core also for future economic growth and prosperity. We risk that some nations this year go into recession. That's also a result of less of trade and investments. We still though see growth in trade, but we don't see the same growth as we saw some decades ago. So what we have to try to do at least is to isolate the protectionism, or the decoupling is maybe a better word, between the G2 and other nations related to areas where there's clearly security interest, where you have dual use of what is produced and etc. I can understand that if 80–90% of semiconductors are coming from 1 or 2 countries, or rare minerals and other products are coming also from some countries that you want to diversify. Maybe you also want to protect your new technology that can also be used for military purposes, but that should be, I think, maybe 10% of the GDP. Still, we then can trade with the next 90%. Then that's about tariffs and protectionism. But then, as also was mentioned, the zeitgeist now, the new word is like industry policy. That is partly, I think, to create level playing field. That's at least what is argued, because some nations, other big economies have had industry policy to support, for example, windmills and solar and all this. And in the US, it's argued that this is like the US moving on decarbonization agenda for the first time. That's good, of course, but industry policy, as already mentioned, also comes with some other aspects, and is not like necessarily those nations that use a lot of taxpayers' money on like industry policy, supporting, subsidizing specific industries will be the winner in the future. It's more complex than that. So firstly, I think on ERA, the Americans rebranded it in Davos from IRA to ERA. And on the ERA, they say that, of course, NAFTA countries can be part of this. And now there are tough negotiations between Catherine Tai and Dombrovskis on also giving more level playing field to Europe. I don't think that's going to move a lot. And then Europe has to decide, are we going to match the subsidies on green hydrogen, on carbon capture and storage, on renewables that the Americans have? Or are we going to see that ostensibly then European companies will relocate to the US? I think the jury is out on this.
Well, the jury is certainly out. And as you all mentioned, I mean, globalization has been rather good for the development of the world. Millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. We have seen they are raising living standards and so on. But of course, we have a war. We had a terrible crisis in COVID that hit the whole world. So it's kind of natural that people get a bit afraid and try to protect themselves from that. But that is only some parts of all the global cooperation and trade that is ongoing. And if you try to shield yourself and say that, well, only those who share our values and who are our true friends, they can trade with us. What about the others? I was in a meeting with Dr. Ngozi, who is the Director General of WTO, and she said that this friendshoring concept, I think it was Secretary Yellen who launched it a year ago. What does it actually mean? If you only trade with friends, who is a friend and what is a friend? And she warned that there are so many countries all over the world, especially in the developing world, in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, who might be your friends, but you don't know it yet. And if they are taken out of the picture, it will hurt a lot. And she mentioned, and you touched upon it as well, Birgit, that if we divide the group into friends and non-friends, it doesn't even have to be foes, it's non-friends, that could affect the GDP, global GDP with 5-6% in a couple of years. And that is, of course, a very, very dangerous development. So Adam, how shall we understand this friendshoring, and what will it lead to? What is the administration's purpose, if you can interpret them for us? I know you might not necessarily agree, but help us understand who is a friend. You're muted, Adam, sorry.
My best understanding, Cecilia, as all of you have served at a senior level in government know, is policies get taken forward not because they're necessarily coherent, but because they have something for everybody in the coalition. We don't officially have a coalition in the US government, but de facto we do, of course. And so when Secretary Yellen of the Treasury or Secretary Raimondo of Commerce, who also advanced the friendshoring idea, they are, putting it bluntly, trying to do the best balance they can between having some openness. They're both more suspicious of trade than, say, some of us, but they're much less suspicious of trade than the rest of the administration. And they're trying to balance having some opening, some reasonability, while catering to congressional and presidential demands for tough approach to China, and secondarily for this energy side. And so friendshoring was vague, was meant to be a compromise that would be better than alternatives where the US more aggressively banned investment abroad or directly tried to steal away investment from other places. The problem is it's never been defined, so there are people in other parts of the US government who are doing just that, as you were discussing, and as was discussed at the WEF about the Inflation Reduction Act. It under the cloak of we're doing some good environmental investment, we're actually trying to create a subsidies war on the assumption we will win. It's basically the Biden administration majority opinion. There are also just deep contradictions and tensions. Again, like you said, you want me to explain it, not say whether it's good or bad, but it runs afoul of similar things going on in the foreign policy security side. And I'd be interested in Borja and Arantxa's views that, Biden wanted to talk about making an alliance of democracies. But, who is a democracy, and do you want to not have any allies who don't meet all your criteria, and you want to kick out allies who do? It's an analogous issue, who's a friend, as you and Ngozi rightly put it. And fundamentally, it reflects US priorities, which are about manufacturing and militarily relevant high-tech industries. And therefore, all the focus is on Europe and secondarily on Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. And Mexico, Canada, let alone developing countries, are an afterthought. And how much this is ideological versus just arrogance that the US thinks everybody has to play along in this administration and in the previous, I don't know. But it certainly is evident. I'll shut up in 1 second. We just had the NAFTA partners meeting last month of Biden, AMLO, and Trudeau. And it's very clear the US is continuing to treat the Mexican economy as hostile in many ways and not prepared to invest in the relationship. Whereas if you're going to friendshore, that would seem the most obvious thing to do would be to support Mexico and Canada. So it's a messy concept. It's a compromise concept. It can be used for both good and ill.
And it seems to be a bit flexible as well. I mean, Venezuela has been a rogue country for quite some time until the oil crisis came. So then the relationships are renewed again. And the same thing in Europe, I mean, chasing new sources of energy, dealing with countries who would not necessarily be democratic and not necessarily friends as well in this. So of course, it's also a lot of pragmatism in this, which could be, which is understandable if you need energy and certain materials. But the EU has also introduced some, it's not so much talking about friendshoring, but it's talking about creating a level playing field. And there has been a long list of different measures taken lately, which all of them one by one could make sense, but if you look at them as a whole, anti-coercion, investment screening, the new international public procurement instrument, the foreign subsidies regulation, and talks about strategic autonomy and due diligence, all by themselves can make perfectly clear sense. But if you put them all together, and if they're not balanced, it gives sort of the same thing. Is Europe turning protectionist as well, just using slightly different tools, Arantxa?
Well, I think for Europe, open markets, as I said at the beginning, is of the essence. I mean, if you look at the growth levels in Europe are below international markets. So part of the EU growth is essentially keeping EU markets open to hitch on the wagon of the growth of its trading partners. And then obviously there are significant interests in the EU business, whether it's on industrial products, whether it's on services, and whether it's in agriculture. Let's not forget, the EU is the largest farm product exporter in the world, and today it even has a net positive balance. So it is essential for Europe that markets are open, and Europe understands that in order to have other countries keep their markets open, it also has to do what it preaches, right? Now, it's also true that today, in a much more geopolitical environment, in an environment where there are also concerns about unfair competition, of weaponization, of undue influence, what the EU is trying to do is build a mechanism that would allow it to keep its markets open, while at the same time addressing the small security, quote unquote, part of the agenda. So it has developed a set of instruments that it has at its disposal, investment screening, unsurprising, basically aimed at protecting strategic industries in Europe, but also other instruments like, for example, anti-coercion, an area where there is no multilateral set of rules and where the EU feels that it needs to be in a position to respond when a partner tries to exercise undue pressure for reasons that have nothing to do with trade, by using trade as a mechanism. So I would say that by and large, in the EU, the equation is not to respond to the, let's say, geopolitical moment with closing its market, but with having instruments to surgically fight spaces where there are questions about fairness. Now, there is a big chapter, which is the one about sustainability. Sustainability of value chains, sustainability of products, whether it's timber, whether it's palm oil, whether it's... so the space of sustainability, the measures that EU would take to ensure that its efforts at having carbon priced in Europe do not lead to unfair competition when imports come into the EU. So this is the space that, in my view, is the trickiest. And this is where I think it is important that Europe, as it tries to advance the fight against climate change, develops tools in a dialogue and in cooperation with its trading partners. It's recently done so with New Zealand, for example, creating a spaces where there is a dialogue between the EU and New Zealand when each one of them is going to introduce a measure on the sustainability side. I think this is probably there where Europe has to be a bit more mindful that part of keeping markets open will also mean extending the possibility to partners to discuss with it the type of measures that are required to protect the environment and fight against climate change. I was therefore very happy to see in Davos last week a group of WTO ministers create an alliance on trade and climate change, precisely to make sure that the measures that are adopted do not lead to trade protectionism and do not lead to unintended consequences, but rather are synchronized.
Yes, that is, of course, and you were there as well, Bergie. I mean, this was something that around 40 countries were there trying to see how they could adopt trade to a more sustainable version. And that is also very much part of the IRA, invest in sustainable technology, facilitate trade in those matters as well. It's of course easier to discuss with friends on these issues where you have more or less the same systems. And behind this, lot of the measures that Europe has taken is, of course, even if it's neutral, that China, they want to make sure that China if it's not playing by the rules, that at least that we have tools to force them and others, but mostly China playing by the rules as well. And a lot of the American actions are also very much targeted towards China. There were a few Chinese in Davos as well participating. The former vice premier, for instance, he was there. He's on his way out, but he gave a few openings. So, and if we want to do really global difference on trade and sustainability, you need to work with China as well. So how do you see that, Greg?
No, so Executive Vice Premier Li He, that still is the economic czar in China. He's left the Politburo, was in Davos and strongly underlined that they're still sticking to the socialist market economy and deregulation. But let me first comment on this energy and climate discussion, and also those more than 40 ministers that formed this coalition, trade ministers that formed the coalition on climate. I think that was very good. And there's two dimensions there. Is one related to trade and tariffs, and then it's this subsidy policy and industry policy. So there is a paradox, and of course, Cecilia, you know this well. We discussed this also as when you were commissioner and I was trade minister, is that there are tariffs there today that makes it harder to export a technology related to like clean technology, green technology, than technology that is related to fossil fuels and coal. That's a paradox. So we should incentivize more and get that corrected. So I'm glad that coalition was formed. But then there is moving into climate change and energy policy and decarbonization. And this is very, very complex, because would we today have seen a situation where we in the 10 last years have seen the price of solar gone down to 1/10? The price of wind has gone down to 1/7. So in the coming 5 years, we can triple the amount of solar that can be built out without subsidies, and it will be the biggest electricity producer in the world. Would that have happened without the incentives? Then there is a second question. Of course, now we see that wind and solar, because of these subsidies, is mainly produced in one country. So how do you diversify that moving forward? Then we also know that for climate change, that is probably the biggest existential threat for our planet. Planet is on fire. We also need to make technologies part of the solution. A lot of the mitigation will have to come from new technology breakthroughs. So how do we make those technologies then cost effective and off the shelf in the future? And here I think we will need to incentivize R&D and etc., because we know that, for example, fusion will not be up and running without a lot of investments. I also know that carbon capture and storage will not be available if we can't scale up, and we need to then incentivize this, and the same with green hydrogen. That was also the basis for this Inflation Reduction Act, but it was not really about inflation reduction. This was like industry policy. I think it will be very important that we create a global understanding on what is the basis for this kind of technology. Of course, you saw that, for example, when Reagan in the beginning of the 80s launched the SDI initiative, that never really came to fruition, but American industry had a lot of benefits from it because the government used a lot of money on things that didn't happen, but that knowledge led to other commercializations of the technology that was great. So we will have, in the years to come, to incentivize new technologies, can deliver then mitigation. But how can we do that without distorting the whole industry and anti-dumping agreements that we have on the table? No, we will have a race, both from Europe and the US, to then subsidize this. And then if you raise it with the Commission, they will say, oh, but China also did the same in the past. That's why they have all the solar, the speed trains, and wind. And in the Commission and in the EU, there is also disagreements there, because we know France and some countries in the South is more inclined to this industry policy, while in Germany, and especially in the Nordics and the Netherlands, there's more reluctance, because politicians deciding where money should go and what will be the future solutions hasn't necessarily been a success in the past, and is not according to the textbook in economics. So I'm looking forward to hearing my colleagues also talking on this, because it really, really is complex.
It is indeed, and there's actually one question coming from the audience on this when you touch upon China, that now, but why is everybody blaming the US for becoming isolationist when it's all in response to China's policy, who have had subsidies forever and nobody really complained about, which I'm not sure is true, but still. No one minded Chinese predatory policies and never complained about China not having a level playing field. The WTO has been ineffective, so why is now the US behaving badly? This is a question from Charmaine in the audience. Do you want to answer that, Adam? Is it maybe it makes it sense for the US to do the same thing as China did?
I think it'd be interesting to hear everybody's views, including yours, Cecilia. But my take is, you know, it is very much the two wrongs don't make a right view. But that sounds facile. So let me explain why I think it's relevant, not childish. I think it's relevant, not childish, because China is cheating on subsidies, and frankly, more importantly, on the exchange rate from 2003 to 2009 on an enormous scale. Did matter, but they mattered far, far less than people seem to think. To use an American football analogy, which will go over like a dead fish, there's no question that Bill Belichick and Tom Brady cheated at times, but there's also no question they would have won the 6 Super Bowls without cheating. Similarly, China's done a lot of yucky things in terms of the global trading system, but except for the height of the exchange rate manipulation in the roughly 2003 to 2007 period, none of it was that material. A lot of it was wasted money and self-harm. And a lot of it was during a period when China was small. So essentially, I'm not saying that excuses Chinese behavior, but just to say there was good reason why the US government and the WTO and others didn't pursue it as aggressively as others might have wanted them to. I and the Peterson Institute, my senior colleagues at the time, were pushing hard on the exchange rate issue. The IMF and the US government failed to act and probably should have. But again, this is second order. What's first order is if the US stops behaving well towards Europe, the developing world, East Asia, then the spillover effects on both US and Europe and the rest of the world are very large. And it creates opportunities for China to the degree that China's a bad actor in the chaos and in being able to play against the system. So to me, this is not, it's not about denying what China did. It's about reducing the sense of importance on the economic side of what they did and focusing on the impact on the world as a whole, including on China, of the US behavior. Nobody ever expected China to play fair.
I remember just not so many years ago, European Union was working, I was working with the USTR of the US and the trade minister of Japan, and we sat together to try to see, could we write some preliminary or draft rules on subsidies that could then be brought into the WTO. And of course, there was a lot of concern on China in this regard. Now, of course, even if China is still subsidizing, as is many countries around the world, the credibility of the EU and US and Japan is a little bit weaker when you do massively the same. I mean, not only the IRA, but we have massive investments in semiconductors, in batteries, and so on. All this is good for the environment, but it creates, of course, a very strange or lack of balance on the global markets.
Well,
so,
I just want to add in though. I mean, this doesn't settle the issue. Shireen's question is very profound, forward-looking, because it does depend on what assumptions you make about foreign policy and national security, how effective you think economic subsidy tools are, how much you think there's a feedback loop, how much can you isolate or decouple, as Borja said, China. And so implicit in my answer were a bunch of, I think, well-founded, but assumptions about that. And there is a reason this is a point of debate.
Of course, no, absolutely. But and then now we're there as well. I mean, subsidies is everybody's subsidizing. So as you said, two wrong doesn't make one right. But how should the EU respond to this, Arantxa? There's a lot of discussions now that the US says, oh, we are investing in good things, and you in Europe, you've been asking for climate investments for a long time. Now finally we do it. Now you complain. Why don't you do the same thing and subsidize your companies? Whereas we know that many companies are sort of encouraged to go rather to the US to make these investments, and that is causing a lot of headache in the European Union to try to find a way here, as you have touched upon before.
No, I think I would say first that on the previous question that one of the audience put forward, I don't think we've been sitting idle waiting to react to what we have felt were unfair trading practices by China. I think both the EU, the US, and many other partners around the world have taken China to the WTO, have obliged, which, by the way, has sometimes ruled in favor of China and many times also ruled against China. And China has, by and large, had to adjust its trading practices to the findings of the dispute settlement of the WTO, which, by the way, was useful in that it was the only instrument we had that we could invoke when we saw something that was wrong. And I think this is what needs to happen anytime any partner does something wrong. In the case of China, there are systemic concerns in addition with a specific practices, specific cases. There are also systemic concerns that have been raised with the Chinese authorities, whether it's on financing, whether it's on state-owned enterprises. But I think the fundamental question we face is, what's the best avenue? Is the best avenue to combat cheating, is the best avenue to become a cheater, or is, when you see cheating, the best avenue to try and find a way to address this through a negotiation? The jury is out. What I think is a bit bizarre is to pretend that becoming a cheater, quote unquote, sorry for using maybe this loose language, will have no consequences on others. It will have consequences on others. And this is what is at stake on the Inflation Reduction Act. The question is not the fight against climate change. Of course, we should embrace, and we like, and we love, and we would encourage more the US being back in the fight against climate change. This is important for us, all of us. It's also essential for the US and for the future of the United States and for the future of US farming and ranching that is so volatile and vulnerable to climate change, to put just an example. But I think the question we ask ourselves today is, how can this be done? Is this by putting America first or putting Europe first, or is it about putting climate first? And I think the argument here that some of us are trying to make is that this is to put climate first. And if the fight is against climate, the nationality of the car, the nationality of the wind turbine, or the nationality of the steel that goes into producing it should matter less than the fact that it is about decarbonization. This is the point that some of us are making, and obviously we want to make this point and through that trigger a discussion. In my view, the way this is going at the moment, with lots of subsidy schemes appearing in the landscape, the best that we should do is foster a discussion in the World Trade Organization by jurisdictions that are subsidizing in a big way about what type of subsidies will get us to climate first versus what subsidies will bring all of us in a race to the bottom, of which we will all be losers. So all roads, in my view, should lead to a debate in the World Trade Organization.
So all roads lead to Geneva, where you are now, Börje. And I think many of us can agree, but we also know that the WTO is unfortunately very weak. And it's an organization that is so dependent on the engagement of the member states. And if a couple or a few member states are not really engaging in reforming it, it's something we have seen, it's really hard to elaborate new global rules or to strengthen those who exist. We saw this initiative last week by member states, by some states to promote green trade, which is good, but there's no rule making yet. And we have this Trade and Tech Council created between the EU and the US, which has a lot of important platforms to discuss issues, but there is no tendency right now, at least, that they are actually also putting up rules that could be used in this regard. So if globalization is in semi-crisis, global governance is also very much in crisis. So how do we solve that issue, or where do we start? If it all ends in Geneva, it starts in Geneva as well, right? But yeah.
So I think we first have to appreciate what the World Trade Organization is also currently doing. As I said at the beginning, trade is still growing, but it's not growing as fast as it did in the past. WTO is overseeing the existing rules and regulations that we have for trade, the traffic rules. And that's an important part of it. So we just have to make sure that you're empowered to do so. Then, of course, a WTO that don't engage or is not given the mandate to make the trade rules system more up to date, or don't have really a negotiating arm, is over time a weaker WTO. And also, of course, if the appellative body that is really the body that can sanction breaking the rules is also weakened, we are in trouble. I think that Dr. Ngozi during MC, the last MC was she got some breakthroughs on fishery subsidies, and then at MC 10 we had phasing out the export subsidies for dairy products and etc. There have been some small steps, but of course the major steps that are necessary on the green technology, also on services, but also on tech, and also how we deal with tech in the future is not really happening. So we see now the plurilateral way of thinking is more and more important, that some countries that are willing go forward, hopefully also in understanding and auspices of WTO, and that can be an alliance that can have others also following after, is probably the most realistic way. And also in such a polarized world, only if Russia then is unhappy, they can of course veto everything, and we can have then a total impasse. So the WTO is extremely precious. We have to protect it and hope that we can protect it and develop it with some steps forward until their zeitgeist will change again. Because in 3, 4, or 5 years, people will say, oh, globalization was really good. You know, we see it's shaving off a lot of growth. We see a lot of more poverty now. We see that the world is not better without globalization. So, you know, these things also goes in waves. So we have to keep we have to keep cool and protect what we have and try to develop as much as possible in a real political way.
It goes in waves, but it also goes by regions. Adam and I, we were in Singapore in November, and there, of course, lots of people from the region were there. They felt the global tensions, obviously, but they didn't confirm that globalization was dead. On the contrary, you've seen quite a lot in the trade area coming from that region lately with the RCEP and the CPTPP and the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement and so on. Lots of regional and bilateral agreements being done there. And the TPP, when it was created by the US to try to assemble friends to be stronger vis-a-vis China. And now this, the US has left, but it is in function, and it has 12 members and 5 or 6 has applied. And it could still, now China has applied, but it could be that forum where you work with allies and friends to also be stronger on the level playing field vis-a-vis China, but the US has left. What would need to happen for the US to rejoin to join CPTPP, Adam?
That's a great question, and my friends in Asia, of course, keep asking this. I think the realistic notion is over the next several years, you can work out essentially a US shadowing of CPTPP, just as the US did bilateral deals with Korea and Japan, altered the Korea-US deal, did a special deal with Japan, has talked about deals with Australia and Singapore, that the US effectively parallels and tries to maintain parity access with what goes on in CPTPP, but the initiative is totally on CPTPP members and leadership to set the agenda. And then the US has to play catch up. It took on huge symbolic freight that Trump, first day in office, remember, withdrew the US from CPTPP. And Hillary Clinton blamed, one of the many reasons she blamed for losing the election in 2016 was that she reluctantly, according to her and her acolytes, would continue to support CPTPP because President Obama wanted it, whereas she ostensibly wanted to take it on and avoid it. So I don't think there's any scenario. There is a risky scenario where China pushes hard to join CPTPP. And even if the US doesn't include a poison pill about other allies joining trade deals with China, you could try to do a brinksmanship strategy of bringing the US into CPTPP, but I think that just escalates and perverts anything. It's much better, frankly, for the US and the members of CPTPP, if CPTPP adheres to its standards for being a high standard agreement, and essentially the same way EU treated Turkey and other accession countries, say, you're not living up to the standards yet, we're happy to talk to you, but until you live up to the standards, and they basically won't China cannot live up to the standards of CPTPP.
That is interesting. There are lots of questions coming from the audience, and we're running a little bit out of time, but there is one question also relating to the climate discussions that we have had, that there are different forums, of course, to discuss international cooperation. WTO is one, and there's G20, G7. Then we have the different COPs, the different climates conferences as well. That could be a place also to discuss climate issue. And the person who is putting this question, Olivier Marty, is asking that the EU plan to launch its carbon border adjustment mechanism will set a new set of rules of market access, not necessarily in line with WTO rules. What are the views of the panel on CBAM and similar initiatives in other countries and potential impact on international trade, in particular for developing countries? Because of course, pricing carbon is something that is going on in lots of countries. Then there are different ways and methods to do it, but the aim is more or less the same. Do you have any views on this? Without going into whether CBAM is W compatible or not, it's actually not totally finalized yet. There are still negotiations ongoing within the EU on how it's finally going to be framed.
What would make most sense is to, of course, internalize the externalities when it comes to climate change. You know, there is a higher, the price for inaction far exceeds the price of action. That's why we should put the global price on carbon. And then you would also see the different technologies being developed because they don't want to pay the tax. That's not happening, unfortunately. That's why we're seeing all these different initiatives. In Davos, we, for example, had a good initiative that I believe strongly is this First Movers Coalition. It's 70 of Fortune 200 companies saying that they will green their supply chain. So Amazon, Apples of the world say, in the future, we will only buy aluminum if 20% is green. That's their prerogative. If you run a company, you're free to buy whatever you want. And if you then want to take care of the climate and use your purchasing power, excellent. On the border adjustment tax, of course, it is a little bit of the same. You say that, of course, we demand such and such a product. It raises, of course, also a lot of discussions with emerging economies like Indonesia, India. Is about North-South. We had it with this discussion of hoarding of vaccines and etc. So it's extremely complex. And on top of it, you have the friend-shoring discussion. As also Dr. Ngozi said, you know, is Nigeria and South Africa a friend or are they not? I think we need to be very, very thoughtful about how we decarbonize the world, but it has to happen faster than it's happening now. So very, very complex, but I think maybe Arantxa can give even a more candid response to this.
Go ahead, Arantxa.
So, I mean, I think at the heart of it is what choice of instrument do you take to fight against climate change? The EU has chosen a carbon pricing, which, as Borges says, if every country in the world had taken, I mean, if we had a world carbon price, we would not be discussing this, but we don't have that. So we've gone for the second best. The EU thinks internalizing the cost of reducing carbon in a price is the way to go. But if it does so, it wants to make sure that it is not importing carbon through its trade, which is where the carbon border adjustment measure comes into place. And what the EU says is we will obviously at the border check that the country from where this product is being imported has a similar, an equivalent effort to the one that the EU is doing through its carbon pricing. Fine with that. We can have lots of brainy discussions by lawyers about whether this is or is not incompatible or compatible with WTO. But to me, what this points at is the importance of in WTO, which is the House of Trade that will be impacted by the measures that every country takes to fight against climate change. There needs to be a debate about the different instruments and the choice that an instrument has on the rest of the members of the organization. So a dialogue, a forum for discussion, which is, I hope, what is going to happen now as a means to reduce the frictions that will come inevitably from the choice of instrument. By the way, the IRA, and it's funny, Adam, because IRA in Spanish means wrath. So when we hear IRA in Spanish-speaking countries, we get a little bit nervous. But part of the problem behind the IRA is the choice of instrument. One constituency, the EU uses carbon border, so basically pricing, whereas another constituency uses taxes. And these two instruments lead to very different results. Hence, again, the importance of bringing this to the World Trade Organization to discuss as a preemptive mechanism to then having to fight it out when it's adopted.
Well, this is certainly another area where global cooperation is desperately needed in order to try to find, even if there are different methods, at least find different standards and different language, because there isn't any one standard on green technology or green standard that the world has adopted. There are even different ways to measure it between the EU and the US. So this complicates matters. So there's certainly a lot of reason to increase globalization in this regard, to try to find common rules on all this. But we are where we are. Börje, you said that it comes and goes in different phases. Is this a phase that will change, Adam? This will probably be your last contribution here, because we're at the hour. Do you see a change coming soon, or is this something the world will have to grapple with for quite some time? You're muted.
Have to grapple with it quite some time. And again, thank you, Cecilia, for marshaling the forces to grapple with it. But I also think that the underlying economic realities, the non-trade aspects, the agency of countries outside the US, all of these are going to matter. And so the changes we're seeing are bad for developing countries, bad for justice and efficiency, but they're not the end of the game. They're a setback. And you can only go so far unless US and China really, or China already is, but unless the US really turns into a crazy national security state, there will be a relatively high minimum level of globalization that will continue. The question is, can we improve the quality back up to what it used to be?
Wow, these are certainly words that would require a follow-up quite soon. See where this is heading. There's so many different angles we could have digged deeper into. But thank you so much, Adam Posen. Thank you, Arantxa González. Thank you, Börje Brende, for spending time here and maybe not answering all the questions, but at least giving them a broader comprehension and making us confused on a higher level, which is always a good thing. So thank you so much, and thank you to the audience who has been listening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, Arantxa, Borja.